All right. Chapter 6, The Synthetic Approach, Ricoeur. This chapter deals with the third major approach to doing philosophy historically, what I have called the synthetic approach. The synthetic approach involves bringing together a number of different philosophical pictures, typically ones that are in tension with each other. It involves trying to reconcile these pictures in the hope of developing an approach to philosophy that draws on the resources of both. The desire to synthesize pictures is widespread and understandable. Unlike philosophical theories, pictures are not the sorts of things that can be proved or refuted. An indefinite number may seem plausible and attractive. As a result, philosophers are often drawn to several major pictures at once, and they may find themselves unwilling to abandon any of them. Those who can show these pictures to be compatible by synthesizing them in their own work provide a valuable service. The practitioner of the synthetic approach with whom I will be concerned is Paul Ricoeur. This should not be a surprising choice. Ricoeur is widely recognized as an unusual synthetic thinker, one whose work draws on an exceptionally broad range of influences. I will not try to discuss all of those influences. Instead, I will focus on Ricoeur's attempt to reconcile two of them, the picture reality articulated by Kant and Hegel. Ricoeur often calls himself a post-Hegelian Kantian, and his readers have long recognized that this position is a valuable key for unlocking his work. I will argue that Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism is best seen as an example of the synthetic approach to doing philosophy historically, and a particularly fruitful one at that. I will begin by examining the term post-Hegelian Kantian. I will discuss Ricoeur's use of this term, and I will argue that his readers have overlooked a crucial feature of it, that is primarily concerned with the philosophical pictures articulated by Kant and Hegel, not their theories. I will also argue that Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism is tied to a specific content, and that it is above all a way of understanding the three Kantian ideas: self, world, and God. Next, I will examine Ricoeur's approach to each of these ideas, and I will show that his view of self, world, and God all involve a synthesis of the Kantian and Hegelian pictures of reality. Finally, I will ask what this synthesis shows about the enterprise of doing philosophy historically. There is one respect in which Ricoeur might seem to a poor fit with the discussion so far. I have argued that we do philosophy historically by constructing a certain sort of narrative, one that seeks to trigger a change in our way of seeing earlier thinkers. MacIntyre and Heidegger clearly construct such narratives. Works such as After Virtue and The Essence of Truth relate long and detailed stories about philosophy's past, stories that directly advance original philosophical agendas. Ricoeur does not seem to write narratives of this sort. To be sure, he has a great deal to say about the history of philosophy, but there is no single work in which he learns from Kant and Hegel by telling a comprehensive story about the development of their thought. Does this make Ricoeur a counterexample to my claim that doing philosophy historically involves narratives? I do not think so. Despite appearances, Ricoeur does try to learn from Kant and Hegel by constructing a narrative. The problem is that this narrative is scattered throughout several different works. As I will argue, in essays such as Freedom in Light of Hope, Ricoeur offers a general account of how Kant and Hegel are related. These essays, however, do not try to synthesize their insights on specific topics in any detailed way. For that, we must look to another work by Ricoeur, Oneself as Another, for example, and his essays on narrative and religion. These works synthesize the Kantian Hegelian pictures on specific topics, but lack the sweeping story told in essays such as Freedom in the Light of Hope. When we read these more focused works alongside Ricoeur's programmatic remarks about Kant and Hegel, we are left with a very comprehensive narrative that is perfectly consistent with other attempts to do philosophy historically. But to some extent, we must piece it together ourselves. Appropriately enough, Ricoeur's synthetic narrative must itself be synthesized. What's in a name? The term post-Hegelian Kantian was coined not by Ricoeur but by Eric Weil. Weil uses this label to characterize his own approach to philosophy. In works such as Philosophie Politique and Philosophie Morale, Weil explores how the universal and essential features of human experience, the Kantian features, might be reconciled with the concrete and historical, or Hegelian. Weil calls himself a Kantian and not a Hegelian because he privileges the universal side, seeing it as more fundamental than the historical. But his Kantianism is post-Hegelian in its insistence that the universal has meaning only in its concrete historical instantiations, and in its claim that studying those instantiations is a properly philosophical task. Even early in his career, Ricoeur was quite taken with Weil's label and found it helpful to apply it to himself. His first use of the term in print seems to be in Freedom of Light of Hope. In this essay, Ricoeur tries to come to terms with the theological trend instigated by Jürgen Moltmann, Albert Schweitzer, and Johannes Weiss, namely the view that Christianity is primarily a religion of promise and hope, a faith, quote, centered on the preachings of the kingdoms to come, end quote, in opposition to, quote, liberal exegetes who make discourse on the last things a sort of more or less optional appendix to a theology of revelation centered on a notion of logos, end quote. Moltmann and his cohort read the New Testament in more eschatological terms. But if we are to join them, Ricoeur argues, we must be prepared to revise our theological concepts radically, to, quote, readjust all theology in accordance with the norm of eschatology, end quote. Foremost among these is the concept of religious freedom, a multifaceted concept that can be approached in several ways and in several angles. In Freedom of Light of Hope, Ricoeur sets out to give a philosophical approximation of the idea of religious freedom, that is, to give a philosophical account of freedom that is compatible with a theology of hope. And he suggests that the most promising way to do this is to draw on the work of Kant. I'm looking at footnote 4 about the Faith Center and the Preaching of the Kingdom to Come. Footnote 4. Though Freedom of the Light was published in 1969, it is a modified version of a lecture delivered in 1968. It should also be noted that Ricoeur seems to have thought of himself as a post-Hegelian Kantian well before the late 1960s, even if he did not use the label in print before then. Bernard Dauenhauer tells the following story. Quote, I recall hearing Ricoeur say some years ago at a professional meeting that Gabriel Marcel, one of his main philosophical mentors, had admonished him early in his career and that he could not continue to try to build upon the heritage of both Kant and Hegel. He would have to opt for one and leave the other aside. Nevertheless, Ricoeur said smilingly, he has spent his career resisting making such a decision. End of footnote. But what would it mean to endorse a Kantian account of religious freedom today? Given the criticisms Kant has faced over the last 200 years, Ricoeur recognizes that we cannot give a Kantian account of freedom in the sense of endorsing Kant's precise conclusions about the topic. These conclusions have been found wanting by Kant's critics, above all by Hegel. As Hegel has shown, Kant's view of freedom, not to mention many other topics, is insufficiently fluid. It tends to see our experience as fragmented into moments that are opposed and unbridgeable, rather than as continuous parts of a larger process. Ricoeur cites the following example of this tendency. Quote, I abandon the ethics of duty to the Hegelian critique with no regrets. It would appear to me, indeed, to have been correctly characterized by Hegel as an abstract thought, as a thought of understanding. With the encyclopedia and the philosophy of right, I willingly concede that formal morality is simply a segment of a larger trajectory, that of the realization of freedom, end quote. Ricoeur goes so far as to say that Hegel's account of this trajectory is the philosophy of the will, and that all philosophies of the will, from Aristotle to Kant, as they're assumed and subsumed. But according to Ricoeur, it does not follow that a Kantian account of freedom is impossible. After all, Hegel's critique of Kant has been subject to critique of his own, some of it decidedly Kantian in flavor. For contemporary philosophers, Ricoeur claimed something of Hegel has vanquished something of Kant, but something of Kant has vanquished something of Hegel, because we are so radically post-Hegelian as we are post-Kantian. The something of Hegel has been vanquished is a hasty desire to totalize, a wish to mediate that which cannot be mediated. In Ricoeur's view, Hegel is too quick to leave behind genuine tensions in experience and to submerge inconvenient oppositions into higher unities. For Hegel, as Ricoeur reads him, nothing can withstand dialectical mediation. Even the most stubborn oppositions can in principle be can't pronounce it. The Hegel I reject, Ricoeur says, is the philosopher of retrospection, the only one who not only accompanies the dialectic of spirit, but reabsorbs all rationality in the already happened meaning. Footnote 6. This criticism is strikingly similar to one that Ricoeur would advance many years later in Time and Narrative. There, Ricoeur accuses Hegel of attempting an impossible totalization, of believing that the history of the world may be thought of as a completed whole. In opposition to this impossible totalization, Ricoeur seeks only an open-ended, incomplete, imperfect mediation, with no into a totality, where reason is history and its reality would coincide. An intriguing difference between these two texts is that Time and Narrative seems more modest in its criticism of Hegel. In Freedom and the Light of Hope, Ricoeur speaks of it as possible to reject Hegel, or to refute his views by means of argument. In Time and Narrative, however, Ricoeur scrupulously avoids saying that Hegel can or should be refuted. He says only that we should abandon Hegel's work sight. This abandonment is not the triumph of an argument, but of an event in thinking. End of footnote. This Hegel embodies a hubristic philosophy of system, to which Ricoeur prefers a philosophy of limits. Interestingly enough, this philosophy of limits is best embodied by Kant, not to be sure the Kant whom Hegel rightly criticized, but a Kant who in his turn understands Hegel. This is the Kant of the dialectic. Ricoeur's Kant is the Kant who reigns us in when we presume to know the unconditioned. He is the Kant who offers critique of our transcendental illusions, while at the same time reminding us of the importance of the ideas of God, self, and world in a regulating experience. For Ricoeur, then, Hegel's critique of Kant stands, and yet Kant remains. What is more, he surpasses Hegel from a certain point of view. For this reason, Ricoeur does not hesitate to call himself a Kantian, but he's adamant that the Kantianism that I wish to develop is now is paradoxically more to be constructed than repeated. It would be something like a post-Hegelian Kantianism, to borrow an expression from Eric Weil. A post-Hegelian Kantian need not accept the letter of Kant's or Hegel's text, but tries to think them always before by thinking them together, one against the other, and one by means of the other. If we wish to understand Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism, Freedom in the Light of Hope is a good place to start. The approach to philosophy described here is one that is sensitive to the fragmented character of our experience. Like the analytical Kant, that is to say, the Kant of the analytical parts of the first two critiques, Ricoeur is aware of the oppositions and dualisms that haunt experience: freedom and determinism, duty and inclination, phenomena and noumena. Like Hegel, however, he recognizes that we must not be too quick to reify such oppositions. Rather than taking their poles as static givens, we should try to think them dialectically, as moments of fluid processes. At the same time, we must not simply steamroll over them. Not every tension can be resolved, and not every opposition can be transcended. It is sometimes necessary to constrain reflection by treating ideas such as God and the world as ideal limits, rather than as objects we can know speculatively. Ricoeur associates this modesty with the dialectical Kant, that is, the Kant of the transcendental dialectic, and the dialectic of pure practical reason, the Kant who offers a critique of absolute objects. According to Freedom in the Light of Hope, then Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism amounts to a resolution to treat philosophical problems from three successive standpoints: an openness to dualisms, and desire to overcome these dualisms by seeking totality, and a modesty about our ability to do so. But the freedom in Light of Hope does not tell the whole story. For one thing, it describes Ricoeur's approach to just one philosophical topic, the nature of freedom. But when Ricoeur calls himself a post-Hegelian Kantian, he clearly intends to say something general about his approach to many different philosophical problems. As we have seen, he applies this label to his views on a number of topics, not just his views on freedom. Time and narrative, for instance, gives what Ricoeur calls a post-Hegelian Kantian account of history, while oneself as another gives a similar account of moral and ethical obligations. Given the many contexts in which this label appears, we cannot understand it with the help of Freedom in the Light of Hope alone. Furthermore, while Ricoeur calls himself a post-Hegelian Kantian with respect to a number of different topics, there seems to be a few which the label is a particularly good fit. Ricoeur seems most inclined to use this label while discussing the very topics in which Kant and Hegel disagree most sharply: the nature of freedom and moral obligation, for example. This is not surprising given Ricoeur's claim to be a follower of the dialectical Kant. After all, in the transcendental dialectic, Kant does not claim that we tend to seek knowledge of unconditioned totalities beyond possible experience. He claims that there are three specific ways in which we do so, and that as a result, there are exactly three ideas of pure reason. These are the ideas of God, self, and the world, and it is with respect to these specific ideas that Kant warns us not to seek unachievable totalities. If Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism were simply a resolution to treat philosophical problems from three standpoints, then it could be applied indifferently to any topic. But Ricoeur, far from applying it to just any topic, usually restricts it to the very topic Kant recommends. An interpretation of Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism must reflect this. It must show that the label is flexible, but that it applies more fruitfully to some topics than others. So how do Ricoeur's readers interpret this label? Some take a deflationary approach, treating it merely as evidence of Ricoeur's breadth and his willingness to learn from different traditions. Bernard Dannhauer, for example, seems to understand the label in this way. He writes, quote, "Ricoeur's way of approaching Kant and Hegel is typical of his Catholic way of appropriating a large number of important figures in the history of philosophy. He is the exponent of the both and the opponent of the either or, thus finds instruction not only in both Kant and Hegel, but also both in Plato and Aristotle, Augustine and Benedict of Spinoza, and Karl Marx and Freud." Quote. Dannhauer is surely right that Ricoeur is an unusually Catholic thinker, and that his willingness to learn from both Kant and Hegel is a good example of this tendency. There must be more to this post-Hegelian Kantianism than this. Many well-known philosophers, Heidegger and Habermas come to mind, display a willingness to learn from both Kant and Hegel, but few, if any, claim that this willingness is central to their work in a way Ricoeur does. Moreover, as Dannhauer notes, Ricoeur is willing to learn from quite a few opposed figures in the history of philosophy, to say nothing of contemporary philosophy. Yet he does not call himself a post-Aristotelian Platonist or a post-Freudian Marxist. Ricoeur singles out the term post-Hegelian Kantian and gives it a special prominence. That he does so shows that it means more than a vague willingness to learn from a wide range of thinkers. Another reason to reject the deflationary approach is that there is a very precise sense in which Ricoeur tries to learn from Kant and Hegel. As we have seen, Ricoeur's willingness to accept elements of their work does not lead him to endorse the letter of their views. On the contrary, in Freedom and the Light of Hope, he suggests that learning from Kant and Hegel might require one to reject the letter of their views. The task, he argues, is to think them always better by thinking them together, one against the other, and one by means of the other. This thinking Kant and Hegel better pertains in some way or another to this thinking differently from Kant and Hegel, something other than Kant or Hegel. Ricoeur does not hesitate to reject large and central parts of their philosophical theories. His Kantianism and his Hegelianism are more subtle than the conviction that Kant or Hegel got certain things right. What is at stake in them is the desire to adopt the spirit or orientation of Kant's and Hegel's work without endorsing their precise conclusions. The point is that Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism has much more to do with philosophical pictures than with theories. Indeed, he sometimes comes close to saying this explicitly. In the essay Hope and the Structure of Philosophical Systems, for example, he says of Kant and Hegel that I do not take them as individual systems, but as precisely as types. Thus, when Ricoeur says that something of Hegel has vanquished something of Kant, but that Kant remains, it must mean that although Hegel has refuted certain elements of Kant's theories, the Kantian picture of the world is still viable. Ricoeur's goal is to synthesize the Kantian and Hegelian pictures in a productive way, to fuse the resources of two general types of thinking in order to respond to philosophical problems in novel ways. The deflationary approach, as I have called it, looks unpromising. Another common strategy among Ricoeur's readers is to interpret this post-Hegelian Kantianism in more procedural terms, to identify it with a certain method or way of doing philosophy. Francois Dawes, for example, seems to understand the label in this way. He argues, quote, the philosophical gesture common to both Eric Weil and Ricoeur consists in the posing antinomies without overcoming them dialectically in a reconciliation of contraries as in Hegel. They maintain the tension of the contradiction up to the point of crisis. This leads not to the overcoming of the terms of the contradiction, but to their overflowing in a shift that allows thought to rebound. End quote. Note that Dawes makes no reference here to which antinomies Ricoeur treats in this way. He does not suggest that Ricoeur's dialectical method is best applied to certain philosophical problems. Dawes presents it as a general method, one that could be fruitfully applied to topics other than the three Kantian ideas. David Kaplan interprets Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism in a similar way. He also takes it to be an open-ended method that might be applied to any number of topics. Kaplan describes this method as follows, quote, a post-Hegelian Kantian recognizes the importance of the concept of totality, but not to the point where social, political, and religious integration becomes the conditional for rational reflection. At this point, it is important to limit the scope of reflection for the sake of critique. Totality, unity, and absolute mediation are only limit ideas that in principle cannot be attained, end quote. How exactly does a post-Hegelian Kantian limit reflection for the sake of critique? Kaplan explains, quote, evidence of Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism appears throughout his career in each of his philosophical meditations. The third term he creates mediates without reconciling. Ricoeur's third way recognizes the aphoretic quality of human experience and respects the plurality of voices and conflicting interpretations while at the same time affirming the ability of philosophy to find reason. Instead of resolving an aporia or succumbing to it, he proposes another option. End quote. So for Kaplan, as for Dawes, being a post-Hegelian Kantian is primarily a methodological matter. It consists in having a dialectical procedure for addressing philosophical problems. a procedure that is not restricted to any particular subject matter. There's a great deal that seems right in Dawes's and Kaplan's account. Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism does involve a specific method. It is clear that from texts such as Freedom in the Light of Hope, that Ricoeur does pose antinomies without overcoming them dialectically, and that he does not respond to contradictions by positing a third term that mediates without reconciling. Ricoeur does approach philosophical problems with a distinctive dialectical method. Dawes and Kaplan describe it accurately. Nevertheless, being a post-Hegelian Kantian cannot just be a methodological matter. As we have seen, Ricoeur does not present his dialectical method as being neutral with respect to content. He does not suggest, as Dawes and Kaplan seem to do, that this method could be applied to any philosophical problem whatsoever. He is most inclined to use this method when discussing the three Kantian ideas: God, self, and the world. As I have argued, this is not surprising, given that Ricoeur calls himself a follower of the dialectical Kant. The dialectical Kant argues that the three ideas of reason correspond to the three specific ways in which we are tempted to overstep the bounds of experience. Thus, the three Kantian ideas are the topics most in need of Ricoeur's incomplete, open-ended mediation, and it is only natural for Ricoeur to focus his dialectical method on them. In addition to all this, we should remember that Ricoeur calls himself a post-Hegelian Kantian, that is, a Kantian who takes seriously Hegel's criticism of Kant. Without a doubt, the criticism that Hegel directs most frequently and most passionately at Kant is that he is a formalist whose theories lack content. He attacks Kant's ethics, for example, as entirely abstract. The categorical imperative, Hegel tells us, is an empty testing procedure that offers no concrete guidance in how to act because it has been implausibly separated from all actual practices and institutions. In short, it seems obviously that a post-Hegelian Kantian would be sensitive to the change that Kant thought is formalistic and lacking in content. So it would be strange indeed if Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism were just a methodological affair. True, it leads him to adopt a certain philosophical method, but this method cannot be entirely content neutral. Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantianism, then, is not just a desire to learn from two different philosophical traditions, nor is it just a willingness to use a distinctive philosophical method, important as this method might be. But what is it? To answer this question, we must look beyond Ricoeur's programmatic statements. Rather than focusing on what he says about his post-Hegelian Kantianism, we should see what he actually does with the three Kantian ideas. We should begin with the idea of the self, and with Ricoeur's most ambitious, though still explanatory, discussion of the selfhood, the 10th study of one self as another. Self. A number of Ricoeur's work deal with the nature of the self. Freedom in Nature gives a lengthy phenomenological description of the self's experience as an agent who wills. And as we have seen, essays such as Freedom in the Light of Hope deal with certain aspects of the self, such as the kind of freedom it enjoys. But what is Ricoeur's ontology of selfhood? What kind of thing does he take the self to be, and how are his views on this matter both post-Hegelian and Kantian? Obviously, a post-Hegelian Kantian ontology of the self would reject the analytical Kant's approach of the self and would take seriously Hegel's criticism of this approach. But it would also find Hegel's alternative unacceptable, favoring a more modest and less totalizing ontology of selfhood. So how does the analytical Kant approach the ontology of the self? So Kant argues that it is impossible to give a metaphysical description of the self. There can be no rational doctrine of the soul. He has a great deal to say about what such an account would look like if it were possible. It would view the self as a substance, and more specifically as a substance that is an object of inner sense. As an object of inner sense and not outer sense, the self would have to be seen as an immaterial substance. The rational doctrine of the soul would also view the self as a simplistic substance and therefore as incorruptible. Finally, it would assert the absolute unity of the subject itself. It would claim that, as regards the different times in which it exists, it is numerically identical. Of course, Kant does not endorse any of these claims about the self, at least not from the standpoint of theoretical reason. Since the soul is not an object of possible experience, any attempt to show that it is a simple numerically identical substance must be a pseudo-rational inference. But while Kant does not think that rational doctrine of the soul can succeed, he is clear about what form it would have to take. For Kant, an ontology of the selfhood must be an ontology of substance. It is well known that Hegel rejects this approach to selfhood. He denies that we should view the self as a simple immaterial substance. Not coincidentally, he is more optimistic than Kant about the prospects of developing an ontology of selfhood. For Hegel, the self must be understood not as a simple or discrete entity, but as essentially relational. It exists not in itself, but for itself. In other words, a self exists as a self only in a certain kind of social context. More specifically, selfhood exists as such only when it's recognized by others' selves. It requires that one be recognized by other free, self-conscious beings through a complex web of social relations. So for Hegel, as John Rosen puts it, truthfully saying I is not something that can be done directly and easily, but it is a process that can be fulfilled only through the support of others. That is, it is a social act. Moreover, the simple social acts through which we initially seek our sense of selfhood, the recognition of one individual by another, for example, are typically too full of contradictions to accomplish what they intend. True recognition requires the richer social context offered by the institutions such as a state with a system of morality and laws. So for Hegel, the self must not be taken to be a substance, let alone Kant's simple immaterial substance. It exists in or as an array of social practices that essentially involve others and evolve according to a complex dialectical logic. It is not surprising that Ricoeur prefers a Hegelian approach to selfhood to that of the analytical Kant. After all, Ricoeur often warns us that Kant's thought can be too static, too prone to reify oppositions. When possible, he prefers to view seemingly opposed terms such as self and other as moments of dynamic processes. Hegel's view of selfhood does exactly that. Where Kant sees a discrete entity, Hegel sees a fluid social process, and Ricoeur would approve of this dialectical approach to selfhood. But there's also something in Hegel's account that would worry Ricoeur. If selfhood exists in or as a series of social acts, then in principle there is no reason the act in question could not be carried out in a perfectly satisfying way. If selfhood involves the dialectical process of being recognized by others, there is nothing that rules out the possibility of others recognizing the self in an entirely adequate way. It is unlikely, of course, that the acts and institutions that constitute selves could ever function perfectly, but there is no way to rule it out, and it seems inevitable that our institutions progress, selfhood moves. That as our institutions progress, selfhood moves asymptotically towards this ideal. In this respect, Hegel's view of selfhood contains a tendency towards totalization that Ricoeur would find troubling. It leaves open the possibility of the self under ideal conditions, becoming an exalted subject, an entirely stable and homogeneous entity, suffering no fragmentation at all. Hegel's account might be preferable to Kant's, but it risks steamrolling over the tensions and contradictions that Ricoeur considers an ineliminable feature of selfhood. A post-Hegelian Kantian ontology of selfhood would have to avoid the pitfalls of both approaches. It would reject Kant's substance ontology by viewing the self as essentially relational and as constituted by a dialectical encounter with otherness. At the same time, It would deny that this dialectical could ever be completed once and for all, or that it could ever take place in an entirely adequate way. In short, a post-Hegelian Kantian would adopt an ontology that makes the self dependent on otherness without being able to triumph over otherness. It would understand the self's integrity as partial and incomplete, as a limit that must be sought, but that can never be fully achieved. Not surprisingly, this is precisely how Ricoeur understands the self. One can find glimmers of this view in many different texts from all the stages of Ricoeur's career. Footnote 26. An obvious example is the theory of narrative identity presented in Volume 3 of Time and Narrative. Ricoeur offers this theory as a solution to the following dilemma. Either we must posit a subject identical with itself through the diversity of its different states, or following Hume and Nietzsche, we must hold that this identical subject is nothing more than a substantialist illusion. According to Ricoeur, this dilemma disappears if we view the self's identity as an identity accomplished by narrative. That is, if we see that to answer the question who is to tell the story of a life. A little later in this discussion, Ricoeur describes narrative identity in terms of very similar to the ones I have used in describing Ricoeur's post-Hegelian Kantian ontology of selfhood. He says that narrative identity is not a stable and seamless identity. Just as it is possible to compose several plots on the subject of the same incidents, which thus should not really be called the same events, so it is always possible to weave different, even opposed plots of our lives. End of footnote. But it is presented most clearly in the 10th study of one's self as another. And it is to this study that we should now turn. Ricoeur's project in Oneself as Another is to develop a hermeneutics of the self. He presents this approach as an alternative to two views of selfhood that are clearly unsatisfactory. The exalted subject of the classical modern philosophers such as Descartes and the shutter cogito of Nietzsche and his followers. Ricoeur sees a third way between these extremes. He acknowledges that the self is fragmented and in some ways opaque to itself, but he does not see it as a totality devoid of unity and intelligibility. His hermeneutical approach to selfhood seeks a compromise that is characterized by an indirect manner of positing the self. The word indirect is meant to suggest that the self's unity and intelligibility are real but limited, and that they result from a series of detours, in which the self encounters that which is other than self itself. If this talk of encounters and otherness sounds dialectical, then it is also sharply opposed to Hegel's dialectical selfhood. For Ricoeur, the dialectical of self and other is not a straightforward encounter between oneself and another, or even between a self and society. It is much more diffuse, the otherness joined to selfhood. Ricoeur says, is attested to only a wide range of similar experiences following in diverse of centers of otherness. While Hegel sees this dialectical as a process that could in principle be completed, Ricoeur denies that the self could ever emerge whole from its encounter with otherness. This is because the otherness in question is not just something found outside the self, but something in the self. As Ricoeur puts it, otherness is not added on to selfhood from outside as though to prevent its solipsistic drift, but belongs instead to the tenor and meaning to the ontological constitution of selfhood. Since otherness is not simply opposed to selfhood, but is internal to it, there is no way for the self to overcome it altogether. Ricoeur presents his view on this matter in the final study of Oneself as Another, entitled What Ontology in View? It is a tentative study, more exploratory than the rest of the book. Yet its guiding question is unapologetically ambitious. What mode of being belongs to the self, and what sort of entity is it? As we have seen, Ricoeur's general answer is that the self exists as a dialectical interaction between a certain type of identity and a certain type of otherness. But he does not leave it at that. He also considers it important to highlight several specific ways in which otherness resides in the self. The first concerns what Ricoeur calls the flesh, or the enigmatic nature of the phenomena of one's own body. A self exists as embodied as a physical being. My body is the locus of my selfhood, but it is also something foreign to me because, as a physical substance among other physical substances, the body belongs to the domain of things. It is capable of being objectified by empirical science and of being understood in a way that makes no reference to my interior sense of self. My body acts on other physical things and is acted on by them. Many of my most vivid experiences, my sensations and moods, for example, clearly result from the ways in which my body is affected by others. Indeed, as Husserl shows in Cartesian meditations, it is only because my body is other than to me that I'm able to constitute the sense other ego, and thus come to understand what a self is in the first place. My own sense of self, far from being more basic than my relation to otherness, is a function of it. To be a self is to be embodied, and to be embodied is to be alienated from oneself through the otherness of the flesh. Since this alienation is essential to embodied existence, it is impossible for the self to rid itself of it. A second way in which otherness permeates the self concerns my dependence on other people. Though I am distinct from other people, I exist among them, and I have already been affected by them. Indeed, some of the experiences that I think of as being most intimately my own are residues of actions of other people. My use of language is a clear example. Every participant, Ricoeur writes, is affected by the speech addressed to him or her. My ability to speak, and therefore to have conversations with myself in thought, is instilled in me by others. So is my ability to act and understand myself as an agent. This ability, Ricoeur claims, is inescapable from the ascription by another who designates me in the accusative as the author of my actions. In much the same way, my experiences of ethical and moral obligations involve encounters with other people, I experience such obligations because I find myself aiming at the good life with and for others in just institutions. My behavior is subject to norms because my actions affect others and because they take place in a social setting. Even in answering deeply personal questions about what I value or which sort of life I want to pursue, I find myself affecting and being affected by other people. Ricoeur takes great pains to emphasize the reciprocal character of my relations to other people. Acting and suffering, he claims, seem to be distributed among two different protagonists, the agent and the patient, the latter appearing as the potential victim of the former. But because of the reversibility of the roles, each agent is the patient of the other. Footnote 29. Interestingly, Ricoeur claims that the reciprocity involved in the self's relation to other people has rarely been noticed. He claims that the best known accounts of this relation are one-sided. They either reduce the self to a mode of existence of others, or they reduce other people to a mode of the self. He sees Levinas as an example of the former approach, Husserl as an example of the latter. Ricoeur repeats this claim about Levinas and Husserl in the Course of Recognitions. In opposition to both figures, Ricoeur claims that there is no contradiction in holding the movement from the same toward the other and that from the other toward the same to be dialectically complementary. End of footnote. The self's dependence on other people does not make it completely passive. But like the otherness of my body, the otherness of other people ineluctably precedes my explicit sense of the self and makes it possible. I could not understand what a self is or what kind of self I take myself to be without affecting and being affected by other people. The presence of other people is thus an ineliminable feature of selfhood. A third way in which otherness appears in the self concerns experiences of conscience. These are experiences in which I feel myself to be guilty of something, to stand accused of something, or to be indebted to someone or something. According to Ricoeur, Heidegger described perfectly the experience of conscience in being and time. Heidegger likens the conscience to a voice that calls out to me and finds me guilty. But it is a paradoxical voice because it is at once inside me and higher than me. It is my conscience that speaks to me. The experience is most intimately my own. Yet the peculiar authority of conscience derives from the way it presents itself as higher than me, as more important than my whims and desires. Conscience, then, presents the self with a unique kind of otherness. It presents remarkably the symmetry, one that can be called vertical, between the agency that calls and the self called upon. It is the vertical nature of the call, equal to its interiority, that creates the enigma of the phenomena of conscience. To be sure, the enigmatic character of conscience gives rise to a number of challenges. The notion of bad and good conscience, for example, are suspect. It must be subjected to a hermeneutic of suspicion. We must also address Freud's claim that the otherness of conscience can be reduced to the otherness of other people, that conscience is another name for the superego. But nothing changes the fact that in conscience, the self confronts an aspect of itself that is foreign to itself. It is a particularly vivid example of the otherness internal to the self. Ricoeur's ontology of selfhood is obviously quite different from either Kant or Hegel's, but as one self as another makes clear, his overall approach to the topic is both Kantian and Hegelian. It is Kantian in the sense that the analytical Kant, in that it recognizes the dualisms and opposed moments involved in selfhood. Though he rejects Kant's substance ontology, Kerr sees that the self possesses an irreducible identity, that it is opposed to otherness. His view of the self is Hegelian in that he does not see this opposition as unbridgeable. He grasps the opposition dialectically and understands the self's identity as a result of its relation to otherness. Finally, Ricoeur's account is Kantian in the sense of the dialectical Kant and its insistence that the self's encounter with otherness can never come to an end and can never conclude in an entirely satisfying way. Otherness, in the form of the flesh, the traces of other people, and conscience, is in the self. No social act or institution can remove it once and for all. The self's own otherness is, as Kaplan puts it, a third term that mediates without reconciling. It mediates the self's substantiality with its relation to otherness, its character as an in itself, with its character as for itself, and it does so in a resolute, non-totalizing way. A particularly clear sign of this appears in the final sentence of oneself as another. Ricoeur notes that he has placed three very different kinds of otherness in the self, and asks, with a tone of Socratic irony, whether they should be described in a more unified way. But he concludes that it is necessary to leave in such a state of dispersion the three great experiences of passivity, because this dispersion seems to me on the whole well suited to the idea of otherness. Ricoeur refuses to give a totalizing description of the ways in which self resists totalization. An account of the self's fragmented character must remain fragmented.